Welcome to today's Vermont Oxford Network Grand Rounds. We have an exciting evidence to practice session focused on the NICU environment. Today, I will be joined with Dr. John Zupancic, who's an associate professor of pediatrics at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center as a moderator, and I'm Danielle Arrett, the Asa Yamaru Green and Gold Professor at the University of Vermont, and I also serve as the Director of Global Health and Chief Medical Officer at Vermont Oxford Network. We have two wonderful discussants with us today, our very own Professor Roger Soll, who's the H. Wallace Professor of Neonatology at the University of Vermont, coordinating editor of Cochrane Neonatal, and the director of our Vaughan Institute of Evidence-Based Practice. Dr. Robert White is the director of the Regional Newborn Program at Beacon Children's Hospital and the adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame. Today's sponsor is the Vermont Oxford Network and our Institute of Evidence-Based Practice. Here are our disclosures. We don't have any particular disclosures to today's topic. And we hope that today's session will be an engaging audience participation webinar. I can tell that everyone has already figured out the chat feature. We hope that you'll send in questions and comments to everyone, and we hope to get to some of those questions and comments at the end of our session today. We'll also have several polls during the session today using Poll Everywhere, and there are several different options to respond to those. And we note that if you put your answers in the chat, they won't be able to be tabulated in the audience participation results that we'll be able to discuss. So there are three different ways to have your Poll Everywhere answers accumulated into our polls. The first is to just use a web browser. The second is if you have the Poll Everywhere app. And then the third is a text option if you have a mobile phone. So we'll give that a try. First, we'd love to hear where everyone is joining from today. We have this listed by continent. We recognize that in real time, there are some time zones that are more ideal than others. It looks like we have pretty big North American and some European and South American presence, and some from Africa. We'll give this a minute, but we're really excited to have an international participation, and the webinar will be on our public website with a video recording for those of you that this is in the middle of the night. We hope that you'll be able to join us asynchronously and contribute to the conversation. So to get us into the topic for today, we have two more topic-focused polls. The first is getting a sense of our audience. The question is, do you have written guidelines that address optimizing sound exposure in your NICU? This is a topic that we'll be learning a lot about today. And it looks like we will have listening ears. So far, about 70%, less than 3/4 of those joining in today have a written guideline. So it's something that we're all thinking about, and we'll be able to hear the evidence and think about putting that evidence into practice with a guideline. So this is, I think, a great area for us to focus on. The next similar question is if you have written guidelines that address optimizing light in the NICU. Light exposure. Interesting that there's a bit of a difference between sound and light. While about 70% were lacking guidelines on sound exposure, it looks like maybe close to half and half have guidelines that focus on light exposure. Really interesting, but I think we'll be looking forward to hearing the evidence and hearing some experiences from our two guest discussants today. So without further ado, we'll move into reviewing some of the evidence. So today's topic will really be focused on the NICU environment. Professor Roger Soll will be reviewing the evidence related to this. So without further ado, Professor Roger Soll, thank you very much.
Thanks, Danielle. The neonatal intensive care is a busy and noisy place. Although we've made significant strides in decreasing mortality in preterm infants, many of our surviving infants experience significant developmental problems in both motor and intellectual development. And there's no doubt that the stressful environment we place them in is a double-edged sword. contributing both to this improved survival, but also to our concerns about developmental outcome. The stresses inherent to neonatal intensive care include the need for frequent painful procedures, pain associated with mechanical ventilation, and major surgical interventions. But today we'd like to discuss the issues around the overall environment of neonatal intensive care, which is so vastly different from the experience of the infant prior to delivery. We'll focus on optimizing sound and light exposure in the neonatal intensive care unit and examine what the evidence is both for the harms and the benefits that are accrued from these exposures. Let's start with sound and noise. The NICU is filled with noise, from monitor alarms, equipment, staff conversations, and is very far from the quiet, protective environment that the fetus normally finds himself or herself in. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that the noise level in the NICU should not exceed 45 decibels. And let's take a look at this figure down here. 45 decibels is the average noise around our home, just above the noise of rustling leaves. When we think of some of the higher decibel levels of exposure, exposures around 80 to 90 decibels are like being in heavy traffic, and exposures above 90 are like subway noises and shouted conversations. There are ways that we can minimize sound exposure and noise exposure in infants. But first, I think we have to take a look at the root causes of the problem. And Mayhew and colleagues looked at this and measured sound levels in a level 3 NICU and described the contributing environmental factors. It's a descriptive qualitative study, and sound levels were measured using a portable sound meter in an open bay level 3 NICU. And here we have some of their results. They took a look at the differences between day shift, evening shift, and night shift, and you can see that the busier day shift is noisier than the evening shift or the night shift, but that all shifts far exceed the recommended levels. Here, looking at the AAP recommendation, we can see that the levels are almost twice that of what's recommended, and in fact corresponds to leaving our sick, critically ill newborns in the midst of the noise of heavy traffic. Multiple linear regression demonstrated significant factors associated with elevated sound levels, including the number of patients being managed in the NICU, the number of people staffing the NICU, the number of alarms, the acuity level of the individuals, and, as I noted, shift type. An understanding of these differences and what contributes to environmental sound is critical for us to address what we can actually do about it. And there is a Cochrane review looking at noise and sound management in neonatal intensive care units. As we noted, the sound level often exceeds the maximum acceptable level recommended by the Academy, and there are consequences of these exposures, with hearing impairment being diagnosed in anywhere from 2 to 10% of preterm infants, compared to less than 0.1% in the general pediatric population. There are many potential approaches to bringing sound levels down into this acceptable range, including treating the entire unit and lowering the sound level in the entire unit, treating individual sections of your unit, the use of private rooms, incubators where sound level is controlled, or using individual earmuffs or earplugs. By lowering sound levels, one hopes the resulting stress can be diminished and that promoting growth and the reduction of adverse neonatal outcomes will ensue. When we look after a systematic review, it's very disappointing. There's only one study involving what is a relatively tiny number of infants. 34 newborn infants were randomized to the use of silicone earplugs versus no earplugs. It was a single center study done by our colleagues at the University of Texas Medical School in Houston. Earplugs were positioned at the time of randomization, and worn continuously until the infants were 35 weeks postmenstrual age or discharged, whichever came first. Newborns in the control group were just exposed to the standard NICU environment. There are surprising results when we look at some of the downstream consequences, particularly mental development based on Bailey-2s at the time, of infants 18 to 24 months corrected age, with a mean difference of 14 and a confidence interval that includes a small improvement of around 3 to a vast improvement around 25. Keep in mind, small studies frequently overestimate the effects of our interventions and are really not necessarily representative. We see the issue of normal auditory functioning at discharge also slightly improved, with a relative risk of 1.65, an improvement in those infants wearing earplugs, and a confidence interval that just barely overlaps the line of identity. All-cause mortality was not affected by the intervention, with a relative risk of 2.07, suggesting improvement, but a confidence interval that is extremely broad. There is no evidence to support changes in growth, including weight and height, no differences in days on assisted ventilation, and no differences in the time of hospitalization. All the evidence was judged as very low based on the lack of blinding and the extremely small sample size. So the authors note that there were no studies that evaluated interventions to reduce sound levels below 45 decibels across the whole neonatal unit or in specific sections of the neonatal unit, and only one study that evaluated the benefits of sound reduction using hearing protection. Given the small sample size, the imprecise results, and high attrition bias, the evidence is uncertain, and frankly, no conclusions can be drawn. That said, people have ventured out and said, we still need to address this important issue, and there's some interesting quality improvement work that has been published regarding sound modification. In Rangaswamy's work, they measured sound levels in the NICU and tried to reduce ambient sound levels by at least 10% from baseline. It was a quasi-experimental quality improvement project conducted over 4 months in a 20-bed NICU. Baseline sound levels were recorded continuously using a sound level meter, and interventions including targeted education, environmental modification, and organizational changes were implemented. Here's a look at their driver diagram, focusing on education, environmental changes, and signage in the unit. And specifically, they looked at education for the staff regarding noise and the ill effect of noise, and discussion of strategies during the PDSA cycles. They lowered the alarm sounds, the intercom volume was adjusted, they silenced phones, they limited the number of people in the NICU, and we could argue that has both strengths and weaknesses in terms of family involvement, and assigned a noise monitor amongst the staff for quiet times, as well as improved signage. They had remarkable improvements. They went from what was, as you saw, the average of around 70 to 75 decibels, down approaching the recommended decibel levels of around 50. And so ultimately, this series of improvements did lead to a reduction in noise exposure. But in a wonderful editorial by Bob White, who we'll hear from later, they note that the road to sensory deprivation in the NICU is paved with these good intentions, and that we're not just talking about minimizing sound exposure, but we're talking about optimizing sound exposure. Probably the article that got people really thinking about the pros and cons of sound exposure is this work by Pineda and colleagues. They want to quantify early auditory exposures in the NICU and evaluate how they were related to medical and environmental factors. They looked at preterm infants who had different settings for care, 33 in an open ward, 25 in private rooms, and quantified their auditory exposure and measured their language acquisition. In their results, they noted a strong relationship with postmenstrual age regarding acquisition of meaningful language, the number of adult words, and the electronic noise that increased across PDA. Silence increased and noise decreased across postmenstrual age. There was more silence in private rooms than in the open ward, with an average of almost 2 hours more silence in a 16-hour period. And there was an interaction between postmenstrual age and room type for word acquisition. This indicated that there were differences in the environment that we nursed these babies in regarding important developmental aspects. And Alan Jobe wrote a very thoughtful editorial that addressed this general issue of sensory deprivation in the neonatal intensive care unit. He noted that there is extensive literature regarding the abnormal sound exposure of infants and recommendations to keep our environment in a much more quiet way. But he noted that sound exposure is critical to the development of normal speech. The fetal environment is not quiet, although high-frequency sounds are filtered out. The human fetus can respond to sounds by 23 to 24 weeks, and the development of the auditory cortex is critically dependent on the auditory environment from early gestation. Deprivation of maternal sounds will interfere with the development of fetal auditory cortex and interfere with language and speech acquisition. So, there seems to be some confusion between our emphasis on sound abatement and the need for appropriate sound exposure from staff and family. The focus on noise abatement has morphed into a goal of silence in the NICU, with exclusion of staff talk and lively discussions on work rounds and parent interaction. The result may be a severe limitation of the exposure of the vulnerable developing auditory cortex to human voices and sounds that are necessary for language development. So this delay is exactly what Pineda and colleagues noted, and it's an interesting contrast between the environment that many of us feel might be too noisy, the open ward, versus the private room. So let's move on to some of the issues around light exposure. Probably one of the core articles that motivated people to reevaluate the effects of bright light exposure is this work from Penny Glass and colleagues, reported in 1985 in the New England Journal. She prospectively investigated the effect of exposure to light in 2 intensive care nurseries by comparing the incidence of retinopathy of prematurity among 74 infants from the standard bright light nursery environment with the incidence among 154 infants of a similar birth weight for whom the light levels were reduced. Glass and colleagues reported a higher incidence of retinopathy of prematurity in this group of infants who had been exposed to brighter nursery lights, particularly for those infants below birth weight of 1,000 grams. They concluded that the high level of ambient illumination commonly found in hospital nurseries may be one factor contributing to retinopathy of prematurity, and that safety standards with regard to current lighting practices should be reassessed. This led to an immediate uptake both in the lay community and in the medical community. The Washington Post picked up the story and headlined that bright lights may be tied to babies' blindness and that hospital nurseries are urged to lower intensity. An editorial that accompanied this in the New England Journal advised hospitals to modify newborn nurseries by lowering lights or installing equipment that automatically cycles lights on and off. But it gets lost in the discussion that this experiment was never intended to look at the impact of retinopathy. The original experiment was intended to look at behavioral changes in infants who are nursed in these bright illumination versus less illuminated environments. And that, in fact, the finding regarding retinopathy of prematurity was an incidental finding that is published in this as a primary goal. Alan Jobe addressed this as well in his editorial about sensory deprivation in the neonatal intensive care unit. A very thoughtful discussion of light exposure is included in this editorial. And Dr. Job notes that although the fetus is in a dark environment in utero, the fetus in fact has a circadian rhythm that is entrained by maternal hormones. The circadian regulator in the brain, the hypothalamic suprachiasmatic nuclei of the very preterm animal, is equivalent to about a 24-week preterm infant and responds to light with increased metabolism and gene expression. Preterm infants cared for in dimly lit rooms or daylit rooms develop circadian sleep patterns independent of cycled light. Nevertheless, development of the visual system requires visual experiences. Sight deprivation interrupts visual development, and environmental enrichment fosters brain plasticity. So these circadian rhythms are critical, and they regulate more than sleep cycles, though there is minimal research to explore all these potential effects. We need to accept the fact that the circadian rhythm and the dark exposed preterm infant does not, with our approaches to light, optimize the development of these infants. Covering of the isolettes with blankets continuously seems to be a questionable, though common practice, because visual development requires light exposure, and that in fact we need more research regarding these issues. And there is more research to discuss. There is this Cochrane review of cycled light in the intensive care unit for preterm infants or low birth weight infants. And this has a much larger body of evidence. There were 20 trials identified involving over 1,600 infants. As we noted, infants are often cared in environments where circadian stimuli are lacking, and exposure to artificial light-dark cycles may stimulate development and improve clinical outcomes, but it remains uncertain whether cycled light is preferable to either near darkness or continuous bright light in fostering development and maturation of these critically ill infants. So they took a look at the effects of cycled light versus near darkness or continuous bright lights in a fairly broad range of preterm infants, less than 37 weeks and less than 2,500 grams. And although there were 20 studies that were identified, only a fraction of them contributed to the data analysis. Data for meta-analysis were available for 11 studies, but that was unclear about the intervention group of whether or not it was dim light or near darkness or other light exposures. So let's take a look specifically at the comparisons of cycled light versus dim light or near darkness. And for this, there are only 3 studies. Regarding the effect on retinopathy of prematurity, there is no difference that can be noted, with a relative risk of 0.89, but a confidence interval that is narrow but extends to 0.76 to 1.03. Only 307 infants, and because of the lack of blinding and the low number of infants, very low certainty evidence. When it comes to looking at the more concerning outcome of severe retinopathy, we see absolutely no difference, with a point estimate of 0.98 and a confidence interval that does include possible harms or benefits, 0.59 to 1.64, but again, very low certainty evidence. So when it comes to cycled light versus dim light or near darkness, we don't see any clinical differences in weight gain. We don't see differences in retinopathy. We don't see differences in hospitalization. No studies looked at developmental outcome, and so there isn't much we can say downstream. The second comparison they included was cycled light versus continuous bright light, and for this there were more studies, but only a few reported on our more meaningful clinical outcomes. There is no data available on the primary outcomes of growth at 3 to 6 months or major neurodevelopmental disability. There is some data looking at duration of initial hospitalization, and interestingly, there's a reduction in the duration of initial hospitalization, but the evidence is really uncertain. The mean difference was about a 10-day reduction, which could range from as little as a 10-day to a 9-day reduction, and so very promising, but still few studies, few infants, and high uncertainty. Despite identifying 20 studies, the authors remained uncertain about the effects of cycled light compared to near darkness or complete darkness on all outcomes of interest. The evidence remains uncertain about whether cycled light is the right choice in an NICU, and physicians and caregivers should weigh the benefits and risks based on the different options of specific settings. So, when it comes to the evidence base is thin, though there's important reasons to believe that these environmental factors do profoundly affect the newborn, and there's reason to commit ourselves to try to optimize these factors of sound and light exposure. And so I'll turn things over back to John and Danielle and our other discussant, Bob White, who, perhaps more than anyone else in the field, has given this the most serious thought and has the most to share with us. Back to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was an incredible review of the evidence. And to bring that evidence into practice, I couldn't be more honored to welcome one of the leaders in the field, Dr. Bob White. Over to you, Bob.
Good morning. I will build off Roger's presentation with some thoughts on what the science he has presented means for NICU design, as well as some big picture thoughts. In the NICU, we have multiple priorities. Of course, we're treating the illness of the babies under our care, but we're also interested in making sure their development is optimal. And we're taking care of families that are at a crucial stage. Sometimes they're just getting started, and in any case, this is a new experience for them, and we have to help them through for an optimal outcome. Even the caregivers, we have to pay attention to their needs because their physical, mental, and emotional health are largely tied in what we do, how we design our NICUs. So the best outcomes for babies and for all these constituencies require both optimal care and optimal design. So let's start with a little history, because many of you probably weren't here back in the 1970s. When NICUs were first started, there was an intense focus on treating illness. We had just gotten surfactant as a treatment that was available. So our NICUs were filling up with preterm babies that previously had not survived. They were bright, noisy, very crowded with little family access. We had SAT monitors we did not have SAT monitors, so the lights were really bright. The only way we could tell if a baby was pink or not was by looking at them or by drawing an arterial blood gas. So we kept the NICUs brightly lit, and they were noisy because at that time, our only way of conveying alarm conditions, apnea or bradycardia, was through audio alarms. They were crowded because survival had increased rapidly, and family access was severely restricted, both due to these space limitations, as well as a conviction that parents would bring dangerous infections into this environment of ill babies with very immature immune systems. Over the ensuing years, this gradually improved. Some alarms could be transmitted visually and eventually virtually. We got SAT monitors, so we didn't need bright light on babies at all times. We started to understand the value of family interaction for a developing infant. And we kept expanding the size of our NICUs to accommodate the increasing survival of ill newborns. But we haven't arrived at or even fully identified the optimal environment of care for babies, families, and caregivers. So this will be the focus of my comments today. And this new focus is taking us away from neuroprotection, which has been our key concern for so long. Now we need to also pay attention to neuropromotion. For so long, we had the environment of care very quiet and dimly lit to minimize the stress on babies and to optimize their ability to grow and development. But we can and should do more. This is indeed a time of crucial brain development. It is meant to occur in an in utero environment that is not silent and which provides ample circadian cues. So while minimizing stressors is important and primary, there should be room for and efforts made for neuropromotion by avoiding sensory deprivation and by offering nurturing stimuli, as well described by Dr. Job in Roger's overview. We have evolved from bright, noisy, stressful NICUs to ones where the greatest danger, I would argue now, is sensory deprivation. So there's an even better environment we can offer to promote optimal neural development. So what does just right lighting look like? We have to pay attention to the needs not only of babies, but of the adults in the NICU as well. Roger has reviewed the Cochrane summaries with respect to babies. My take on that is that at 32 weeks and above, cycled lighting is not harmful, may be beneficial to babies, and I think it provides a subliminal message to both families and caregivers that babies can receive interaction rather than needing to be asleep and unstimulated 24 hours a day. We also know that caregivers benefit from access to higher lighting levels away from the bedside, especially on night shift when the lighting in the baby space will be dim. And here's some research we did many years ago to document the benefit of better lighting at night for caregivers. We looked at their body temperature and the feelings of wakefulness and showed that if we could keep lighting levels good in the nursing stations away from the baby's bedside, that nurses were both more awake and their body temperature is warmer. I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but if you're in the NICU in the middle of the night, nurses are often bundled up because they feel chilly, and this is just normal behavior of our circadian rhythms. So let's look at the design implications of the science that Roger has shown you and the additional information and thoughts I've provided with respect to caregivers and families. First, the design standards that are recommended are for ambient lighting levels in quite an extensive range. There needs to be good color rendering and no bright lights directly into the infant's space. So the big picture for lighting is, for babies, we need to design the baby's care space so that ambient, task, and circadian lighting are optimized. Caregivers need their work areas designed to meet their needs, especially for those who work night shift. Families, we should provide family area lighting at the bedside that meets their needs, and then another space, hopefully in the patient room, where they get daylight and their lighting condition can be separate from what's going on for the baby. A general consideration is that lighting sends subliminal messages. It can be intense and harsh, or soft and soothing. It can be warm or cold. These are things we shouldn't leave up to engineers. There's much more to this story than how many foot candles and the placement of lights. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So in terms of the big picture, though, stay tuned. I expect that eventually the Cochrane reviews will establish the benefit of circadian lighting in babies. So an optimal design should at least allow for that capability. Here's an example of a best practice. At the bedside, there's adjustable indirect lighting to provide the ambient light, as well as task lighting at the bedside that's adjustable in intensity and direction. There's lighting over the work counter opposite the bedside that is also adjustable in intensity and color spectrum. At the rear of the room is the family area with window to the outside and independently adjustable lighting. This design gives the baby what they need, while the needs of caregivers and families, which are somewhat different, can be addressed as well. So lighting is not only about how many foot candles you provide, it's about placement and spectrum, adjustability, and the psychological impact that it can have for better or for worse. So let's talk for a few minutes about sound, design considerations. Working principle here is to minimize the negative and accentuate the positive. Noise isn't good for anyone, and nurturing sounds, music, conversation, that's good for everyone. In our design, we need to think of putting sound-absorbing surfaces everywhere we can. in the ceilings, on the walls, on the floors, in the hallways, even the furnishings of the room. We need to use technology to get alarms away from the bedside. And then control extraneous sources of noise. Sinks, towel dispensers, trash, these are all sources of noise that we need to think about in our design, and we can design in ways that will minimize them. And very importantly, we need to make space for parents, not only because that space will provide better dissipation of noise from the room as a whole, but the more a family is present, the more likely the baby will get nurturing voice and music, even the heartbeat of the mom and dad when they're being held. In our NICU, this atrium is the first thing that families see when they enter. It announces to families that we want them to feel like this is more like home than a NICU, and that daylight and the sounds of children will be embraced. So, design takeaways. First, good design can improve the physical and mental health of all the occupants of the NICU. Good lighting and sound management are important ways this can be accomplished. Second, families are crucial stakeholders. Include them on the design team. And you don't have to wait to build a new NICU to do this. You can ask parents and staff how you can improve and make your unit more nurturing and holistic. Caregivers have an important biological response. We need to take their needs into consideration. And finally, the final takeaway is that NICUs that were once the source of excessive light and noise, but the solution is not to simply limit those whenever possible. There is a sweet spot that optimizes nurture while minimizing stressors. One of the key references for lighting and sound are the recommended standards for newborn ICU design. Those are available online at this website. But coming next year will be a supplement to the Journal of Perinatology that has multiple articles on physical elements in the NICU that can enhance the experience for babies, families, and caregivers. It will discuss lighting and sound, but many other elements as well. So please, final thoughts. Don't think of lighting and sound simply in terms of foot candles and decibels, any more than you would think of food in terms of calories. They can be so much more. Light and sound are rich, diverse sources of important stimuli during a crucial period of baby's development. So while the quantity is important, the quality is even more so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. That was incredible. I really loved how you balanced how the environment impacts all of us, babies, families, and caregivers. And I hope it has spurred some thoughts and questions from our audience of more than 500 now. And so happy that we have about 20 minutes of time left for comments, questions. And I think maybe to spur off some of that, we have some word clouds to get everyone thinking, which we can supplement by questions coming from the chat. So the first word cloud, we'll have two, is really thinking about optimizing light. So if you can put in one or two words describing some of the issues that are critical to optimizing light exposure in your unit. And I think both Roger and Bob showed how context is really important when we think about environment, but there are things that we could do today and tomorrow. So let's see what words come to mind. So fun to see this in action. I think what's jumping out to me is really the natural piece of this environment, having windows, having natural light in addition to the elements of the lighting that our engineers are putting in, to Bob's good point.
You know, Danielle, I think the other thing that I find interesting about this is that the central, or one of the central words, lighting, is also something that is perhaps most amenable to change without redesign of the unit. So it's true that putting in a window is difficult, but light can be changed. And it brings up something that is on the chat as well for Bob and Roger maybe to comment on. If you're not redesigning your unit, what is the low-hanging fruit that we could get at to optimize? What can people take away now before the article in Journal of Perinatology comes out?
One suggestion I would make is to pick a single project. Maybe it's light, maybe it's sound, depending on what you think is most compelling in your unit, and work on optimizing that for your unit. Let's say it's lighting, appropriate lighting for babies, and giving them a circadian rhythm at some point. 23-weekers don't need circadian lighting, but 33-weekers probably will benefit from it. And certainly that's what they're likely to get once they go home. So we need to model that for families as well. So if you want to try implementing cycled lighting for some of your bigger babies, that's one possibility. Maybe you're already where you want to be with lighting and you just need to reduce your background noise. Or maybe you've already done that really well and you need to introduce more nurturing sounds into the baby's environment. You can identify where you are and where you want to be, and that will suggest what project might be most useful for you to undertake. And I think there is plenty of data out there when you pick one of these projects that you can use, as well as a lot of practical experience that many of us would be happy to help talk you through.
So, Bob, let me ask you, are there some things not to do? Because I remember when it suddenly became every baby was under a quilt. And the quilts were very pretty and they were, made by wonderfully loving people. But it strikes me that is overkill. But I see in the chat some people asking for the micro preemie, maybe for other babies. So I'm curious, are there some behaviors, not all the things that we should be trying to improve, but some things that we're doing that we really should back away from? I'm curious your thoughts and Danielle's and John's.
Yeah, so it depends on where you are in your process. If your NICU is open bay and it's really bright, then maybe incubator covers is the best way you can protect your babies. But if you have an environment that you can turn the lights down, the problem with incubator covers, and I will say this about earmuffs or earplugs as well, is that you get rid of the bad, but you also get rid of the good. You're not allowing any nurturing sounds in the case of earplugs, or circadian stimuli in the case of lighting. You're not allowing any of that to occur. So certainly get rid of the bad first. And if incubator covers are the only way you can do that, then that's where you start. But once you're past that, start thinking of ways to help with the nurturing stimuli.
I didn't discuss some of the evidence about what might be good, like music, reading, and other things. Is that what you mean when we talk about the nurturing stimuli?
Yes.
Going forward, Roger and Bob, as you think about studying nurturing stimuli, for example, or what to avoid, one thing that jumped out at me in your review is that we were actually looking for severe neurodevelopmental impairment as the outcome. What do you think we should be looking for, either for people undertaking quality improvement projects or for folks planning to do research in this area? Maybe there might be some of those in the audience as outcomes that to attach to studies or to interventions.
So I take your point, John. Sometimes we elevate these devastating outcomes that are in some ways unlikely to be impacted on, and we lose sight of all the wonderfully important intermediate outcomes. I'll throw one out that Bob alluded to, which is the relationship with the family and the staff, and just the satisfaction of talking, reading, whatever. And so we don't measure enough about the family's experience. Bob, what other outcomes would you like to see? I mean, we could throw out weight and other issues. I'm curious what you think.
I haven't seen many studies on bonding, and I'm really fascinated. When I go over to Europe, I always use this example of a NICU I visited in Spain, in Barcelona, that must have been built in the 1960s. But it was as ancient as a NICU you will ever find. It was an open bay, of course, and there were 6 or 7 mothers sitting around in a circle in rocking chairs, rocking their babies. And I thought, what a wonderful experience that was for both the babies and the mothers, and something I had never seen in a United States NICU. So this bonding baby and family, I think, is a piece that we don't measure for sure, and we should pay more attention to.
Beautiful image, Dr. White, and I think you've stressed this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and there are things we can do today. Even in that open bay unit, there might be one wall with windows, and are we thinking about each bed space differently, and how we can be thinking about the full family, caregiver, and baby's interactions. I wonder if we might move on to the next word cloud, which thinks about optimizing sound. And as everyone is putting in their 1 to 2 words, and we're waiting to respond to that, I was curious, Bob, if you could get us started. What impressed me in discussing this with you is really the difference between noise and sound. And I think that cannot be overemphasized when we're thinking about optimizing the environment for our babies.
So just talking about decibels, it's really important to get the background noise down so that the nurturing sounds can be heard over that. But I wanted to be sure people didn't go away with the idea that nurses or families need to whisper to their babies so that they don't get above 45 decibels, even under those conditions. Music, conversation, those are okay to get above 45 decibels. And the lower you get the background noise, the easier it will be for those things to get through to the baby without that kind of competition. So just like you don't have to keep babies in darkness all the time, you don't have to keep them in silence all the time. And so please don't try to limit the volume of a conversation that a mother or father would have with their baby. Certainly the music shouldn't be played too loudly in an incubator, but those are generally going to be good things, and we should encourage.
As we look at this word cloud, we should take the opportunity to refer people who are concerned about the one in the middle to listen to the grand rounds on alarms that happened a few months ago, because I think it's directly relevant to this. Optimizing alarms might be a case of optimizing sound and noise.
Yeah, if you don't already have the technology that takes nearly all of the alarms away from the bedside, you need to talk to your hospital administrators to get there. There's a few respiratory alarms that there's no remote transmission capability, but for the typical alarms at the bedside, they just shouldn't be happening anymore. We're way past the need for that. I see a comment in the chat about hard to limit sound in a city center location with major bus routes directly outside. I guarantee you the high-class hotels in that area have figured out a way to minimize sound. It can be done. If you're got an administration that's doing value engineering, they may not want to invest in it, but the technology, the capability is absolutely there to do that.
Bob, I see a few questions in the chat focused in on sound about sound machines in general, but I'm also curious. I know there are some that can have recordings of parents' voices, and so I guess the machine's very close to the baby, and then does it matter also what the sounds are that are coming out of those machines, and thoughts about that as it relates to noise versus more optimal sounds?
I'm skeptical of those, just like I am of pieces of gauze soaked with mother's breast milk, or that she wore next to her breast and then put in the baby's incubator. Those passive exposures are not how babies learn the positive signals of a sensory input. And they're present even when the baby's getting their heel stuck or their endotracheal tube suction. So I'm not at all sure babies associate that with a positive experience. And I am sure the data on that is not persuasive. It is very limited. And so I would discourage people from trying to replace natural input from human beings with these other inputs that are well intended for sure. But I go back to the idea about the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Be careful that you're not introducing abnormal, it's not abnormal, unnatural sensory input to babies when we should be presenting the real thing. And I see a comment about skin-to-skin care is the ideal remedy, and I agree with that 100%.
Our good friend Mike Dunn asks about routine respiratory care, so the technology that we bring by the bedside, and what, if anything, do we know about the various noises and or abatement of some of the noises from that technology? Any thoughts?
I'd like to hear Mike speak to that, but he probably doesn't. Michael, you, I know you can speak to this really well, and I'm sorry we can't put you on to give us your thoughts. So I'm going to defer just because there are other people who can speak to this better than me.
I've always thought bubble CPAP would be a soothing thing, but maybe I've just made that up.
It does bring up the idea, because I think you mentioned, Bob, in your presentation, or maybe it was Roger, that the isolettes used to be, the incubators used to be a very high contributor to ambient noise. And I'm wondering if the reason that was changed was that our community was interacting with device manufacturers, and if that is still an ongoing process to address Mike's comment around ventilators or around other equipment that we use.
Yeah,
so that was part of Alan Job's editorial, as he mentioned that, and absolutely, you're right. There was pressure to say, look, this is the safe environment we're putting these kids in for a variety of reasons in terms of temperature control, humidity, etc. But it was noisy, and that feedback absolutely led to better engineering. And so your question about whether or not that is also true for other aspects of the needed technology that we put at the bedside, I think is worth considering.
Yeah, I've had a lot of contact with people from Draeger, and they have very actively worked on this problem and use it to promote their upgrades in their incubator technology as they come out with new devices. They're speaking a lot to how their environment inside that incubator is better for the babies than their competitors and their old models.
I like some of the comments in the chat that say that the noise from these various technologies are annoying to the staff as well as the baby. Probably true.
There were a couple of questions about the SENSE protocol. I noticed. Does anybody want to?
We use the SENSE. We've used it for many years. I have a lot of interaction with Bobby. I pointed out some things in the protocol that I didn't think were evidence-based, and she has taken those into account. And so I think it's been modified along the way with various people's comments. I think it is as evidence-based as anything that's out there, and NIDCAP was preceded it, and I don't have anything adverse to say about NIDCAP either, but SENSE, I think, takes it to a level at the bedside that NIDCAP maybe didn't as well. So in the absence of anything better, I think SENSE is definitely worth people looking into.
I did put the link in the chat. I'll put it in again in case it's passed people by. But it definitely is a comprehensive approach. And as Bob says, I'm not sure I understand or know or agree with each component, but it's all worth considering. And it is very thoughtful.
Roger and Bob, I was curious, as we just have a few short minutes left, I think we're all now waiting with bated breath to see the supplement that's coming out in 2026. We also have a VON Quality Congress in 2026. And so if there are quality improvement projects that are ongoing, we of course would love to be hearing in real time, but also see some posters presented at that opportunity. If we have, there's a year until that meeting, and if teams are thinking, what can we do today? What can we do tomorrow? Any challenges to us of things maybe that we haven't been thinking of before this session today? Maybe the focus has been on the baby and the decibels and not as much on the caregiver's perspective of the environment, for example. Any calls to action or challenges for us in the coming year related to optimizing sound and light?
Well, I won't speak for Bob. I'll let him have the final word. But the thing I'm most impressed about from what Bob presented was that it's not about what you should do when you build your next new unit. It's about what you can do now. And the idea that you can't attack everything. Think about where your problems lie, sound, light, etc. But there's a lot that you can evaluate now. And you look at some of the other quality improvement issues. I mentioned Raghuswamy's work. You talk about SENSE, that there really is a lot you can go back to your unit and think about and improve tomorrow. Bob, last word to you.
The best environment you can provide for babies is to get them out in their parents' arms. And if you don't have parents there because they won't or can't come, then nurses can do a little bit of that, and volunteers can do a lot of it. We have volunteers who are in holding our babies all hours of the day and night. Get the human contact, and you will get the sound and light exposure that's most suitable for that baby at the same time.
Well said. I don't think you'll find any disagreements on that point. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, both Dr. Way and Dr. Soll. We really appreciate the evidence and to practice. For those of us joining live or reviewing this video within the next month, we have 1 hour of continuing education credit. You can either scan the QR code or there will be a link in the follow-up email that you'll receive. And we hope that you come back in 2026. We'll be kicking off the year with an evidence to practice focused on transfusions, both packed red blood cells as well as platelets.